Like, I mean, if you're serious about thinking about this problem, then you know that the solution is always going to have to involve looking much more closely at the social and political context of these young people's lives, and dealing with the root cause of it, which is not the absence of policing. The root cause of it is to do with the poverty, the marginalisation, the institutional structures, the broader sets of norms and values and cultures that operate. Right.
So I'm really delighted on this episode of the Equiano Pod to be joined by Arun Kundnani. First of all, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Anaya.
So Arun is a writer who has been active in anti-racist politics and anti-racist movements in Britain and the United States for several decades. And he's written
Wait a minute,
several books.
several decades. That makes me sound 70. I'm only in my 50s.
Three decades.
Okay, that sounds about right.
3 decades. And he's written a number of books. The Muslims are coming, Islamophobia, extremism, and the domestic war on terror. He's also written The End of Tolerance, Racism in the 21st Century in Britain. And most recently, he has written What is Anti-Racism and why it means Anti-Capitalism. So really interesting range of ideas and things that has been explored in the book, and I'm really looking forward to getting into it. So firstly, your title, Why Anti-Racism Means Anti-Capitalism. Could you firstly just give your summary of your book and what you mean by that? Because a lot of people will hear that and be surprised. They'll think, actually, I believe in capitalism, or whatever economic different idea that they have, but they see anti-racism as just not treating people differently because they have a different race. So why do you think anti-racism means anti-capitalism?
Yeah. So the first part of the title is what is anti-racism, right? So we've had a lot of books come out over the last few years about anti-racism, how to be an anti-racist, various books around those themes, and a lot of there's been a lot of people thinking about those questions in various settings over the last few years, right? And really, what I'm trying to say is we maybe want to take a step back and say, well, what do we even mean by anti-racism? Like, you gave a reasonably accurate definition of how most people understand it, I think, in a country like Britain or the United States, right? But actually, what I'm saying is there's actually two different traditions of anti-racism that we can trace, like running through the 20th century up to the present day, and they actually imply very different things. And I call it the liberal anti-racist tradition and the radical anti-racist tradition. And the liberal anti-racist tradition is more or less what you just described, right? The idea that countries like Britain and the United States, through some kind of historical legacy, have inherited these ideas in our heads that whether consciously or unconscious bias, that imply kind of racist attitudes of some sort, and that leads to various forms of discrimination and so on. And that's what we need to tackle. And we tackle it by a process of addressing those unconscious biases, right? And getting people to be aware of how they might be channeling racial prejudices that somehow are lodged in their minds, right? So it's very much focused on belief, attitudes, doctrines, bias, unconscious or conscious, right? And that goes back, that tradition of thinking about what anti-racism might mean really goes back to the 1930s in Europe and how people were trying to make sense of Nazism, actually, right? We can get into that more if you want to. But the other tradition is the radical tradition, which also really has this moment in the 1930s when it starts to be theorized and talked about particularly by scholars in parts of the world that have been colonized by Europe. And their idea of racism, it's not about a psychological thing, like a set of attitudes or biases in someone's mind. It's a social structure, right? And it's about how societies distribute resources differently on the basis of race, right? And how that, so the examples that they would have been giving in the 1930s were countries that have been colonized by Europe. So say, for example, Kenya, or say, for example, Jamaica, where, a small white minority at that time would have controlled the wealth of those countries, and the black majorities of those countries would have had no way of accessing those resources, right? And so it's a different picture. And what's what's interesting is that radical tradition, we've kind of lost a sense of it, but it's the only way that we're really going to be able to take on the way racism works today, because liberal anti-racist technique of taking on people's individual prejudices has kind of run its course. And at this point, I think it's a distraction from what we really need to be doing, which is to thinking about how do we dismantle these structures. Now, structure is a slippery word. It's hard to get a hold of, right? It's much easier to understand something like prejudice, but structure is the problem now. And the only way we can understand that structure is by understanding how it's a product of our capitalist societies, right? And how capitalist societies depend on a kind of material racist reality in order for them to reproduce themselves. And we can get into the details on that if you want, but I'm afraid that's what we, even though that's a harder ask for us to get our heads around that and to think about how we might change that, that's actually the only option we have at this point to really tackle the vast racial disparities, both within countries like the UK and the US, and the disparities between the kinds of lives people enjoy in those countries and other parts of the world.
There is a lot to get into there, and lots of questions that I have asked following on from this. So I would actually class myself as a liberal. And so it's very interesting hearing many of your critiques of liberal anti-racism, many of which I would agree with. But there's a few things I want to touch upon. So you mentioned the colonization and the way that it was structured to exploit certain racialized minorities and majorities for the benefit of white Europeans. But most liberal anti-racists would oppose that. They would agree that the way that system was organized was and is a problem. And therefore, why do you see that as, how do you understand that? Because actually most liberal anti-racists today would say that was wrong and that we've moved on from that, and that we want to create. They would agree that we should create systems and structures and institutions that are not necessarily privileging or disadvantaging people or organizing material resources on the basis of race.
Well, let's look at, if you're looking at the world today, let's look at some of those infrastructures that that we ought to be focusing on and dismantling and creating alternatives to, if we're serious about anti-racism. So we ought, like right now in the United States, every year, about 1 million people are removed from the country back to Mexico. That is a policy that is a form of ethnic cleansing. It involves very serious violence, often death, in order to uphold that policy. Why does that policy exist? How do we understand where that policy comes from? What's its roots, right? And obviously we can talk about similar policies in Europe and in the UK. The UK has, in the last year or so, provided a safe route for a very large number of Ukrainians, white Ukrainians, to come to the UK, and made it incredibly difficult for people from, say, Afghanistan to come to the UK. Like they're literally being there's a kind of death by policy for people from Afghanistan, right? Our border policies in the UK and in the US are a form of institutional racial segregation, right? We're effectively trying to segregate at the border. And so where does that come from, right? Now, on the liberal anti-racist perspective, you would have to focus on some notion that there is, that those policies are the result simply of maybe, right-wing demagogues who are able to whip up, people's individual prejudices, their unconscious biases in order to push for those kind of policies. That's just not the historical record, right? Like those policies have been implemented and advocated for by neoliberals as much as neoconservatives. They come from the liberal centre as much as from the far right. And what really drives those policies is the need to maintain a racial division of labour that is central to how capitalism works globally, right? So the fact that in El Paso in Texas, El Paso in Texas is part of a broader conurbation that includes Juarez in Mexico, right? And there's a border that runs through that conurbation, so that one side of it is in the United States and the other side of it is in Mexico. But it's one conurbation. Now, why does that border exist? And moreover, why does that border have attached to it racial meanings? Like, the idea of that border is not simply to separate two nations, but also to maintain a kind of racial identity for one nation on one side of that, called the United States, right? So why does that border exist? It exists because on the other side of that border in Mexico, workers can be employed for a fifth of the wage that they would be paid on the other side of that border in the United States, right? So it enables a kind of higher level of exploitation of workers on one side of that border, which increases the profits available to the corporations who outsource their production process to the Mexican side of the border, right? So the border is functional to a process of capitalist accumulation, right, and profit making, right? So if liberal anti-racists can acknowledge all that with me and come with me on that, we're all good. There's no disagreement. But we don't see that, right? We actually don't see that. And we can multiply the examples here, right? Like, let's look at some of the other infrastructures of violence that have this racial character apart from borders. Things like in the United States, mass incarceration, things like the highly aggressive policing disproportionately targeted at black communities in the United States. How do we explain that? So when you look at that closely, we've had for decades liberals arguing that the solution to those problems is diversity training for officers, so it's assumed that the problem is there's a minority of police officers in a country like the United States or a country like the United Kingdom who are the sort of rotten apples in the barrel, and if only we can kind of get those officers either out of the job or to get proper training to make them more professional in their conduct, to follow the rules they're supposed to follow of how to do policing, then we would remove this problem. And that's been the proposed solution from liberal anti-racists for decades, and it hasn't solved the problem because it doesn't understand the core of the problem is that violence, again, is functional to a system. It's not just like the outcome of particular individuals who have particular hatreds or biases. It's functional to the system. Why? Because in a country like the United States, in the present, over the last 50 or so years, since the 1970s, as it's moved to a particular form of capitalism in which large sections of the population, disproportionately black, are going to never be in waged work, they're never going to be employed, they're essentially abandoned by society, thrown on the scrap heap. They might be described as surplus populations. We don't think of them anymore as a people we can give any role in society to. So what is the solution that capitalism and the institutions and the think tanks and so on propose for this population? They're quite explicit about it. The think tanks that have advocated for this kind of society and have been able to build it. They say, we just have to use violence, policing violence, prison violence, in order to manage this surplus population that can't be integrated into society. And so we get the outcomes that we see, right, in terms of the much greater likelihood of black people in either Britain or the United States being killed by the police.
So I want to, so all of the critiques that you've made of liberal anti-racism, so I want to get into that in a moment, because there's a lot that I agree with you on, and I want to dive into that a bit more. But just on those 2 points, because that's one of the things that I found very interesting, reading your work, is how you see the immigration discussion and the prison and policing discussion as deeply intertwined and connected to the anti-racism discussion. And I understand the connections that you made, but I guess thinking about what other people would think, I think some people would be surprised to hear that border control, for example, is inherently a racist endeavor. So it's not only Western countries that have borders and enforce their borders within, and so on and so forth, even using violence or whatever. So what do you say to the fact some people might say, well, that is what it means to have a nation state, that's what sovereignty is, and this is something that all countries, generally speaking, pursue.
Yeah, and You know what? I don't like the word inherently. Actually, I find it unhelpful sometimes personally, and so I wouldn't put it quite that way. That like border controls are inherently racist, right? I think, if the Native Americans, implemented border controls when they were being colonized, it would have been a good thing, and it wouldn't have been racist. It would have been anti-racist because it would have saved them from experiencing a genocide by Europeans, right? So yeah, they should have had border controls to save themselves, right? Possibly the same would, argument could be made about Palestinians. Like, I think they want to stop a kind of migration called Jewish settlement, right? And that's an anti-racist move, actually, right? So I think it's highly dependent on the context, like how you look at borders and what they're doing, right? But in the case of Britain, and if you look at the history of so in Britain we haven't always had this border regime that has been built up over the last few decades, right? If we think about this historically, this really goes back to the late 1960s when we started to look at the need for ever tightening borders, new immigration laws year in, year out, this constant attention to is there some kind of weakness in our border controls that's allowing this migration to occur? Understanding migration as essentially an invasion, right? Understanding migration as a problem of people with fundamentally and irrevocably different values and cultures coming to this country and weakening our culture that needs to be defended, right? Now, that whole way of thinking is new, actually, historically, right? It emerges in the late 1960s. It comes, the main person who kind of developed that way of thinking is someone called Enoch Powell, right? And it subsequently has been adopted by the two major political parties year in, year out. And so I don't think that, we can understand what we see today with how borders work in the United Kingdom as simply a function of the normal need for nation states to assert some kind of sovereignty. It only really makes sense if you understand how it's a product of a particular form of racial mobilizing and racial politics that has just become a regular feature of British political culture, and how that itself is tied up with, as I was saying earlier, the need for a kind of global system to maintain borders in order for certain kinds of exploitation to take place. Because essentially, if you are by European countries in the United States and other countries in the West maintaining a kind of military style border system that prevents people from the global South entering the West by and large, right? It enables workers in the global South to have lower wages, right? And that's essentially why it's in place.
So what do you say to those who might say, well, two points. So some people might say, well, even in spite of that, there has been a lot of immigration, post-war immigration. And so even if there's been those internal tensions and the discourse has had peaks and troughs, actually Britain, by and large, has accepted, I don't know what would be the best way to say it, but has allowed for hundreds of thousands of people to come over the last 20, 30, 40 years. So how do you view that? Because even, despite that Britain has got a very large foreign-born population.
Right. And so, there's two parts to that, right? So one is our communities in Britain, right, have had to fight tooth and nail to win some kind of minimal rights for us to uphold the right to come to the United Kingdom as an asylum seeker and have, it's kind of been diluted down to barely nothing at this point, but we've had to fight to just even to get to that level where someone, at least on paper, can come to find their way to the United Kingdom and make a claim for asylum, and there's some kind of process to that, right? And some of those people will end up staying. So it's partly that, against the odds. That wasn't something that just happened, right? That there's some kind of asylum process in Britain still in place that had to be fought for very hard by folks, in communities and so on. At one point in the 70s, 80s, I mean, it's possible to imagine that Britain could have gone the other way, right? And that Powell's injunction to essentially ethnic cleanse Britain and remove, the million or so people of colour that were in the country at that point, that could have, it's totally possible that could have happened politically, but it didn't, mainly because we, our parents, our grandparents stood up and fought back, and it became, and did so successfully to kind of prevent what was politically possible, right, from Britain being able to carry that out. That kind of ethnic cleansing, right, and we've had to fight right through those decades up to the present day to try and build this situation that now conservatives kind of hold up to the world as a kind of model of kind of multicultural well-being, which is a partial picture. I mean, there's some truth to it, right? Like, I mean, if you think about the level of interpersonal relationships in a city like London today, by and large, what does it feel like for people from different ethnic backgrounds to interact, like across the garden fence, on the doorstep, at the school gate, and so on? Pretty good. Certainly better than when I was growing up, right? Certainly a lot better than when I was growing up. And that's because we won some battles that we had to fight, right? All kinds of hidden battles, those stories that are never actually written down in books about how people in local neighborhoods, had to really get hardcore to defend their rights, right? And so the outcome, this model of sort of supposed celebrating British diversity and multiculturalism, that people sometimes invoke, especially conservatives like to invoke that as a kind of model to the world. Well, that's down to us, right? We fought for that, but. And the other part of this is, sorry, just one added thing on your original question, which is, so the other part of this is that there are also, again, reasons why capitalism likes to have, in a country like Britain, a certain number of workers who are undocumented, who've entered the country without, the paperwork they're supposed to have, and that becomes another kind of highly exploited workforce, right? Like, the people picking the fruit in the fields that, so that when there's a sudden increase in nice weather and everyone wants to go to Sainsbury's on Sunday morning and buy a load of lettuce that morning, like there's a load of workers in the fields in Lincolnshire or whatever who've picked those lettuces, last minute on that Saturday afternoon, so that we can have that convenience of turning up to the supermarket at that point. Now those workers are typically undocumented, highly exploited, and so it's beneficial to the system that workforce exists as well.
Mm-hmm. What do you say to those who say that it's more of an economic question rather than a racial one in terms of what motivates immigration policy? So, for example, Britain has opened the border to a lot of people from Hong Kong, and I think there's been liberalising policies around immigration from high-skilled workers from India. And so what do you say to those who say, well, perhaps if certain countries in the global south became were much more developed economically, that would change the attitude in Britain towards welcoming more people? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so the way. So in your question, you're counterposing, like, either it's a racial explanation or it's an economic explanation. And the whole burden of my argument, as you can tell from the title of the book, is that something that we think of as an economic system like capitalism and something that we think of as something outside of that like racism are actually bound up with each other in very intimate ways, right? So you're right in where you're going with your question. I think if you think about if you think about the highly skilled migrant program in Britain, it's absolutely you can totally explain it in terms of the economic advantages that are perceived to come to Britain from having something like that in place, right? The thinking would be you bring in people from a country like India who have are perceived to have a set of skills that are in demand in Britain's capitalist economy. Let's say a computer programmer, right? Now, who's paid for that person to get those skills? The Indian government, right? So it's way cheaper for Britain to have someone come in from India as a computer programmer than it is for Britain itself to spend money to train people to be computer programmers, right? You kind of get that for free from a poorer country, right? And there's an assumption, some of the thinking as well here that drives that policy is, in fact, that there is a way that if you bring in people from those particular kinds of backgrounds from a country like India, they're more likely to be kind of obedient workers, right? They're not likely to cause trouble as much as someone who's grown up in Britain. They're more likely to be passive, right? And so it's also a choice in that sense, right? Which involves a whole set of racial assumptions, right? So you can see the sort of economic and the racial coming together here, right? And you think about the history of Britain's immigration policy in the kind of post-Windrush decades, right? So the main kind of variable that drives which particular parts of the world are sending people to the United Kingdom, in the period from the 1940s through to the 1960s, early 70s, it's the British Empire, right? It's like South Asia and the Caribbean, primarily to a lesser extent Africa, right? So those people are coming to Britain as a kind of they're coming to do the jobs that people here didn't want to do, right? They're coming to do the worst kinds of work, the night shifts in factories and so on, right? And so it's about a fraction within the existing working class, adding a new fraction on the basis of race to bring in those kind of workers, right? Now, the whole shift from the 1970s onwards is actually to say we don't want to make the working class multiracial like that anymore, right? But certainly we still want to use immigration policy to try and shape the kind of population we have. And the key question is the way that we're using immigration policy to shape who works in Britain going to make it more or less likely that we have obedient workers who get on with things without getting involved in political agitation, without getting involved in union organizing and so on. That's the key question. And they're trying to interpret like that. And their assumption is the person who's come from a graduate school in Ghana and then is coming into Britain, in some kind of what it would be understood to be a professional role, is way preferable from that point of view to someone who's coming in from a working class background from Trinidad, right? These are the kind of calculations they're making. All of it is bound up with all kinds of racial assumptions, right? Even though both of those two categories are black, right? And all of it is about how do you use race and immigration to maintain the stability of the capitalist system and to maximize the profit making of the most powerful corporations in the UK, who basically have the power to shape these things, right? And that's the political process here.
So just on policing, quickly before we go on to liberal anti-racism more broadly. So I want to drill down on your views on that, because just in the last few days in the UK, for example, there's a teenager girl who was stabbed to death. And it sparked a national discussion about serious youth violence, why so many young people in London carry knives and so on and so forth. And a lot of the response and the discussion has been around the fact that actually we've not had enough visible police. We've not had enough police stopping and searching and really clamping down essentially on or having a lax attitude towards young people carrying weapons and things like that. So some people might find it difficult to hear that, to have much sympathy with the argument that it's a problem that the state has uses institutions that have the power to use violence if they perceive the act to be in pursuit of what they might regard as a just cause, clamping down on criminals. So because I know that because I remember in 2020 the discussion about defunding the police was very much part of the discussion, and I think that might have actually divided people. And some people argue that divided people because they didn't necessarily see that as the route to the problem of maybe militarized police. So what do you say is that? How do you make that argument palatable, essentially, in the context of at least what is perceived of as a really big problem with serious youth violence in London, for example, but also other parts of the UK?
Right. Well, I mean, people carry knives because they don't feel safe, right? They don't feel safe. And so, like the root problem here is how do we create a situation in some of our poorest communities in Britain where people feel safe, right? Is that going to be done by simply giving more and more powers and more funding to the police? I don't think so, right? I mean, we've kind of tried that. That's been the broad trend over the last 50 years. The police have, compared to the kinds of powers the police had when I was growing up, like 40 years or so ago, the police now are essentially operating with what are basically like totalitarian powers, like huge powers, right? They and that hasn't, caused a decline in these kinds of problems of youth violence that you're talking about, right? And we all know, if you're serious about thinking about this problem, then you know that the solution is always going to have to involve looking much more closely at the social and political context of these young people's lives and dealing with the root cause of it, which is not the absence of policing. The root cause of it is to do with the poverty, the marginalisation, the institutional structures, the broader sets of norms and values and cultures that operate, right, in these settings, right? All of that, right? Like youth workers on the ground will tell you this any day of the week, right? And so when you look at that is about resources, amongst other things, right? How much money are we spending on youth work in London, right? Or in other parts of the UK? We've cut it right back, right? In part to put more money in the police, right? Which is a completely counterproductive way of trying to respond to this, right? So the sort of standard response, the standard political response to outrages in terms of violence in young people is always, let's look at how the police can solve this. And we do that time and time again, and we never get to the root of the problem, right? And we sort of know this, right? I don't feel like this is some kind of radical new concept, right? Like people have always understood this, right? That that these kinds of harms that young people do to each other are ultimately going to need a kind of approach that involves a broader kind of social justice approach to dealing with it, rather than just thinking of it as we meet their violence with our greater violence that the police are capable of.
So where do you fit individual and or community responsibility within this? Because some people would argue that actually there are some communities that or some groups that even if they are in poverty or facing deprivation in different kinds of ways, are still less likely to be involved in serious youth violence. So do you place pretty much all the responsibility within the structure of within institutions in the state, or do you see any role for individuals?
I mean, the first and foremost, someone commits an act of violence against another person, they're individually responsible for that act of violence, right? But I think your question isn't really about individuals so much as some notion perhaps of culture or ethnicity versus structures like institutional structures in the state. Is that what you're pointing towards?
It's an open question because I think about, I'm of Nigerian heritage, and I don't know if all of this information is completely accurate, but there's been a discussion about race which where some people talk about, for example, if we look at educational outcomes, uh, British Nigerian young people are doing much better than other ethnic groups or other cultural groups within the UK, and trying to understand why that is. Is it, some people talk about immigrant optimism, and the certain values and ideas that they're inculcated with, that make that value education. Um, so guess what? Yeah, maybe the question is about to what part does culture within particular communities, if does that play a role, or how much of a role
I
that you
think I think we make a mistake when we think of these things in terms of ethnic difference rather than like I think different communities have different origins and get placed in different class positions within British society, right? Like I think a good example here is thinking about the United States, where this kind of argument has got a more a longer history, right, of the idea of the model minority. So in the United States, so unlike in Britain, South Asians in the United States are seen as a model minority, right? Wow, here's a group of people who aren't white, yet nevertheless they seem to be doing really well in terms of their educational outcomes, in terms of like the jobs they kind of get, and their level of wealth and so on, statistically all correct. So then, you without looking more closely, people tend to say, oh, there must be, this must be about some kind of cultural variable here that's at play, right? Whereas really it's about immigration policy, right? Because the way that people from India in particular have been admitted into the United States is on the basis of you can only come to the United States if you're from a highly elite background in India, by and large, and you offer, and so most of the immigration from India to the United States is PhDs, which of course is a tiny percentage of the billion people in India, and so to then allow that tiny elite population from India of PhDs and their descendants to stand in for this idea of an Indian ethnicity with certain characteristics and so on is totally misguided, and we do the same in Britain. I think in the example you gave, so there is to some extent there is going to be something to do with culture at play in any situation like this, right? But cultures are highly dynamic, actually, right? They're constantly changing and transforming through these processes of migration, generational change, the social context that people are placed in, and so on, right? What is more important in understanding this is things like what kinds of people from Nigeria have been admitted into the UK and settled here in Britain, right? What kinds of, and how do they compare in terms of their class background from, say, people from Jamaica and Trinidad, right? It's about class, it's about immigration policy, much more than some notion of ethnicity or culture, in my view.
Well, I no, that is, I do find what you said quite convincing, and I actually think it is interesting. I know many uh, family members and friends that from Nigeria who, for example, were very successful, um, and came to the UK, and they had limited or no papers, were deported, and had to do very low paid jobs, even if they were educated, but they still had certain attitudes that they passed on to their children. So I think I do understand where how you relate immigration policy um, to the discussion about where certain minorities are positioned within the class structure in Britain. Okay, so no, I think this will be very interesting to many people that listen to this podcast. I think that you bring in a different view, and a different perspective on these issues that I think are still obviously very, very live and being discussed. We don't have a lot of time, so I want to just move on finally to the discussion about liberal anti-racism. So where where do you think do you think I know that you rooted the discussion about how liberals see prejudice and unconscious bias in something in the early 20th century, but why do you think that the radical approach has not necessarily gained enough cultural authority. And yeah, well, why do you think that is?
Well, I think the main reason is because I mean, the radical approach is more of a threat to the system and the vested interests that profit from the system, right? And so there are huge huge walls we have to knock down in order to approach it in that more radical way that is actually the only way that's going to work at this point. And the sort of liberal approach that focuses just on unconscious biases and so on is completely compatible with the status quo at this point. That's why you can have Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the most powerful financial institution in the world, talking about how we all need to tackle systemic racism and using this language that seems like it's serious about tackling these structural issues, but it of course isn't. And so that tells you how that kind of liberal approach is. I mean, it kind of shores up and legitimizes the system that we have rather than being a threat to it. And in the book I write about some of the thinkers in the 20th century who developed what I call this radical approach to anti-racism. I mean, it's striking that most of them were imprisoned or killed, right? I mean, it's which wouldn't be true of the liberal anti-racists, right? So we're talking about positions that were highly suppressed, right up to the present day. One of the people I write about, Jamel El-Amin, is still in a federal prison today as a political prisoner, right? So that is the main reason why it hasn't had a broader kind of acceptance.
But so just finally, because there's many liberal anti-racists that I know that would agree. So I don't know if you know John McWhorter, Thomas Chatterton Williams.
Sure.
Or Coleman Hughes, people that, and others in the UK as well. Maybe, I don't know if you know Timiwa Walade.
I do. I know his work.
That they are liberals, and they would completely agree with your critique of so-called woke capitalism, or the way, or critique of unconscious bias training and diversity training and all these things, and how that doesn't actually deal with entrenched inequality and resource redistribution and so on. So that there is a liberal critique of liberal anti-racism is essentially what I'm saying. But you think that doesn't go far enough?
I mean, I think those folks that you mentioned, I don't think they do share my critique of liberal anti-racism. I think they just they have another kind of critique of liberal anti-racism, right? That sort of sometimes resonates with what I'm saying, but it's not actually the same. And they certainly wouldn't come with me in the arguments I make about about the way that racial capitalism works, these issues around borders and policing and so on. They wouldn't share that. But I think without those parts of it, you simply are attacking certain manifestations of liberal anti-racism without having any other kind of anti-racism to replace it, except a very kind of a very limited approach that just says more or less we've dealt with the problems of racism. It was a legacy of the past that we've kind of addressed now, more or less, and what remains is something that we can address just with the equal opportunities legislation that we have in place, and the sort of like colorblind approach of kind of saying we should all kind of treat each other the same. Not going to scratch the surface if that's all we are willing to do in terms of anti-racism. Not going to do anything to help us tackle these huge systems of violence in terms of borders, in terms of policing, in terms of imprisonment. We haven't talked about. I mean, for me, the biggest question is the way that the US and the UK are at the helm of an international system of violence in terms of the way that global capitalism works, and the way that things like the wars on terror and the wars on drugs become part of that, resulting in, kind of genocidal violence, really. We haven't even begun to grapple with that, and I don't see any of the folks that you mentioned even wanting to go anywhere near any of that stuff, which is why I find their kind of critique incredibly limited.
Arun Kundnani, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me,